Okay, let's unpack this. Europe. A continent just steeped in Christian history, right? These incredible cathedrals everywhere.
Absolutely. They're landmarks.
But here's the thing. Despite all this long-standing state support, we're talking clergy salaries paid, tax breaks for churches, funding for church schools.
Yeah, a whole infrastructure.
Exactly. But many traditional Protestant churches, they're struggling to connect with people now in this sort of postmodern era.
It really is a curious situation. You have these magnificent buildings, symbols of centuries of faith.
And often they're pretty empty, aren't they? Secularism seems to be rising. People are looking for maybe different kinds of spirituality.
It's a definite contrast. All that history, all that support, but maybe not the same grassroots energy within those specific structures anymore.
Right. Which leads us to the big question for this deep dive.
Right.
Where are the dynamic, ground level Christian movements in Europe today?
And the sources we've looked at, they really point away from the traditional centers, don't they?
They absolutely do. It seems if we want to find where Christianity is maybe flourishing unexpectedly, we need to look elsewhere.
To the fringes, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission here is to explore some of these surprising instances. We're talking about movements often characterized by, meeting in homes, lay leaders stepping up, lots of prayer, sharing their faith, often among groups that might be considered marginalized.
It makes a certain kind of sense.
Mm.
When institutions become maybe too established, too comfortable, perhaps too tied to the state, they might lose some of that inherent drive, that evangelical impulse. So looking at communities without that legacy, that's where you might find something different.
Which brings us straight to our first focus area, the experience of refugees in the Netherlands.
Right. These are people who definitely did not inherit that church-state legacy.
Not at all. They're coming from, Africa, Asia, often fleeing trauma, just seeking safety. And the Netherlands set up these government processing camps.
Which kind of unexpectedly became these points of contact, didn't they?
They did. And this is where we encountered the ministry of Larry and Laura Hughes, missionaries.
Yeah, they were initially involved with an international church in Eindhoven, I believe. And they noticed just how many refugees were part of the congregation.
A significant number, yeah. And the Hugheses, they had this vision. It wasn't just about ministering to the refugees.
No, it was more empowerment, wasn't it?
Exactly. That whole teaching them to fish idea. They wanted to equip these refugees to minister to each other, to start their own faith communities.
Which they started implementing around 1997. And you have to remember, this was a really diverse group.
Totally diverse. Different cultures, languages, really only connected by their transit through the Netherlands. But the goal was this church planting movement idea.
Empowering locals to start self-sustaining churches, not just relying on the missionaries.
And what's really striking is how receptive the refugees were.
Yeah, despite everything, the trauma, the uncertainty, the diversity, they really embraced this idea of starting their own churches.
So by the end of that first year, 97, they had about 10 of these small cell groups meeting.
And then the next year, these started evolving into actual churches, led by lay people, just ordinary believers stepping up.
Okay, now here's where it gets, kind of mind-blowing. There's this email from Larry Hughes in 1999.
Ah, yes. I remember reading about that.
He said they'd started maybe 15 groups the year before. They went back to the U.S. for 6 months, came back, and they could confirm at least 30 new churches had sprung up. And he suspected the real number might be double, maybe even triple that.
Wow. That's incredibly rapid multiplication.
Isn't it? And Larry's explanation is key. He said it was because these house churches had lay pastors, lay leaders, almost straight away.
So new believers got baptized, felt empowered.
Yep. Given a Bible, and boom, they just started new Bible studies all over the country spontaneously. He even said they couldn't really control it or even keep track of it all.
That's amazing. It really speaks to the power of empowering that local leadership, doesn't it? Especially in a fresh context.
It's such a stark contrast. The Netherlands, long seen as maybe hard soil for the gospel.
Right, resistant.
And yet here, among this transient, marginalized group, you have this incredible spiritual dynamism. It really challenges assumptions.
It does. Now, there was a follow-up visit, wasn't there? July 2000, after the Hugheses had left.
Yes. And the new team, the successors, they were clearly doing good work. Lots of outreach, very effective. One missionary had baptized over 90 refugees in just a year.
So the evangelism itself was still strong.
Definitely. But, and this seems crucial, that specific focus on the church planting movement, that vision of empowering refugees to multiply churches themselves?
That seemed to fade.
It looks like it. The constant turnover of the refugee population was always a challenge, obviously. They were always moving on.
Right, a very transient situation.
And without that sustained focus on transferring the vision, on equipping each new wave,
The movement sort of stalled. It regressed back to a more, let's say, traditional missionary approach.
yeah. The initial momentum wasn't sustained. It highlights how important that vision transfer and leader development is, not just the initial outreach.
A really fascinating case study, though.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears now from that refugee context to another really remarkable story, the Gypsy Evangelical Movement, mainly in France and Spain.
Ah, yes, this one is quite something.
You mentioned that quote from the Baptist missionary in Spain saying being called evangelical was basically the same as being called gypsy.
It really underscores how deeply that faith took root within that specific community.
It does, and finding detailed reports in English is apparently tricky given their marginalized status.
True, but the scale of it did get noticed sometimes.
Like that New York Times piece in '83 talking about maybe 250,000 adherents, 60,000 baptized. That's huge.
And Professor Liégois in France noting this rapid Pentecostal growth across Europe, originating back in the 50s.
The numbers are impressive. England, Spain, these huge gatherings, like 25,000, 30,000 people in France in 2000. And it was specifically a Pentecostal movement, right?
Yes, characterized by experiences like speaking in tongues, divine healing, that sort of thing.
And Stephanie Kreider's thesis from '89, that really sheds light on the origins, drawing on Spanish sources and her own background there.
Her work is really valuable for understanding how it all started.
And the origin story itself is quite dramatic. Lizaz, Normandy, 1950. A gypsy woman, Duvel Reinhardt.
She gets a tract, her son is sick, she seeks prayer at an Assembly of God church.
And the son gets healed, miraculously, according to the accounts.
Which leads to the whole family converting, and then it just spreads through their extended family network, like wildfire almost.
Yeah. And that Assembly of God pastor, Le Cassec, he talks about baptizing 30 people soon after and then 3,000 in the next year.
Incredible growth right from the start. It obviously struck a chord.
And it spread fast. Manouche tribe, Spanish gypsies in France, Rome and Italy. Then in '65, 7 Spanish gypsy converts go back to Spain as missionaries.
Focused on their own families, which seems key.
That familial connection, yeah. The statistics, again, are just, wow. 3,000 baptized by 58, 10,000 by 64. By 79, maybe 30, 40,000 members, 150,000 attending services.
Huge numbers. And specific figures for France and Spain in '79 show thousands of believers, hundreds of pastors. It had spread to many countries by the early '80s.
Le Cassec remained involved, estimating maybe 50,000 to 150,000 adherents in France alone by '83, these massive conventions.
And those original 7 missionaries to Spain, they became revered figures, didn't they, like apostles?
Yeah, facing real hardship, even persecution from within the gypsy community itself initially.
They were sometimes mockingly called alleluias, or priests.
Which is ironic because alleluias fits their praise focus, and priests kind of fits the lay preacher model.
Exactly. And alongside the growth, there were all these accounts of, well, signs and wonders transform lives, physical healings, Pentecostal experiences.
Their worship sounds like it was really culturally embedded, like 90% praise.
Very expressive.
Music adapted to gypsy styles, flamenco guitar, clapping, and the messages, short, simple, biblical, often parables.
Which makes sense given potentially varying literacy levels, easier to grasp and pass on.
Prayer was also massive, right? All-night vigils. Leadership training centered on this idea of coming from the mount, deep prayer life.
Absolutely central. And their meeting places were flexible homes, rented halls. It suited a more mobile lifestyle.
And most pastors were bivocational, holding down regular jobs.
Yeah, out of necessity mostly, which meant congregational giving could go towards things like conventions, missionary work, rather than just salaries.
Their leadership training was also unique, no seminaries.
No, it was all about lay preachers, mentored by experienced pastors, proven leadership over a couple of years, then maybe presented at a national convention. Very practical, hands-on.
So why did it take off so powerfully among the gypsies? What were the factors?
Well, several things probably played a part. Their history of persecution, perhaps making them more open to a message of hope.
Could be. Less attachment to traditional European church structures, too.
Definitely. That allowed for more participation, more culturally specific ways of worship. And as you said, it was a faith they could take on the road.
It's interesting to contrast that with how some traditional missionaries in Spain operated.
Right. Some focus more on the general Spanish population, the payos, and maybe saw the gypsies as, well, difficult.
So it's that difference between ministry to a group versus a movement from within the group.
Exactly. That indigenous leadership, that cultural ownership, seems to have been incredibly powerful here.
Okay, so we've seen these really dynamic movements on the fringes. What about signs of hope within sort of mainstream Western Europe? Anything bubbling up there?
There are some hopeful signs, yes, even in that context often seen as more resistant.
Like what?
Well, there's the International Christian Fellowship, ICF, in Zurich, started in '96 by a couple of young Swiss evangelicals. They focus specifically on the 18 to 24 age group, using home cell groups. And within 5 years, they grew to over 3,000 members. Pretty remarkable.
That is significant growth, especially among young adults.
Yeah.
Anything else?
The Alpha program, primarily out of England, it's become a really well-known tool for evangelism, often happening in homes.
Ah, Alpha. I've heard of that. How does it work?
It's basically a course, maybe 15 weeks, introducing core Christian beliefs. But it's designed to be really open, welcoming, often starts with a meal.
Nice. Breaks the ice.
Exactly. And they actively encourage skeptical questions. It's meant to be a safe place to explore, and apparently it leads to quite a few people deciding to convert.
What makes it effective, do you think?
Well, practitioners say getting non-believers into those small, informal home settings is key. Creates community. And allowing those tough questions without demanding immediate answers, that seems important too. Often the group experience itself is part of the journey to faith.
Interesting. And it's spread quite widely, hasn't it?
Oh, massively. Started by an Anglican clergyman, Charles Marnham, back in the '80s. Then Nicky Gumbel took it over in 1990 and really expanded it.
The numbers are big, right?
Yeah, by '99 they were saying over 1.5 million people had done the course in like 17,000 churches. By 2001, they'd trained tens of thousands of leaders. It's even used outside of churches now.
Wow. But is there a but?
Well, the observation in our sources is that despite its reach, the main users of Alpha are still conventional churches using it as an outreach tool.
Ah, okay. So it's feeding into existing structures mostly.
Largely, yes. Which raises the question, can something like Alpha break out of those structures? Could it spark the kind of self-multiplying church planting movements we saw, however briefly, with the refugees or more sustainedly with the gypsies?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
It brings us back to that kind of overarching theme, doesn't it? That maybe all the effort Europe put into supporting official Christianity.
Paradoxically, might have made the fringes the most fertile ground.
Yeah.
What's
Places outside the mainstream structures.
So just to wrap up this deep dive, we've seen some really compelling examples of unexpected spiritual energy popping up outside the established norms.
Especially among marginalized communities. The refugees in the Netherlands, the Gypsy Evangelical Movement, these show the power of grassroots, lay-led faith.
And stands in such contrast to the struggles we often hear about from the traditional state-linked churches.
It really does seem like sometimes the ground that looks hardest, the most resistant to conventional approaches.
It can actually yield surprising fruit when the conditions are right, when people are empowered, when it connects culturally.
So, a final thought for you, listening in. Given these examples, where else should we be looking? What other overlooked corners of society might hold seeds for unexpected growth, maybe transformation, not just in faith, but maybe in other areas too?
It's a great question. What happens when we really shift our focus away from just the big established structures and look towards empowering individuals, empowering communities on the ground? These stories offer lessons that go beyond just religion, I think. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?